What we have in front of us here is a number of valves that represent some of the history, the evolution of how these valves got started. Initially, we had half-inch pipe thread, similar to this style right here. Just a straight valve, what we call a K-valve, with no reserve. As time went along, they decided, okay, I guess we better have a reserve. And so they had reserves of a J-valve style like this.
Then they moved into this direction where they actually had a K-valve, but with the ability to change the J with a button that was in front of you so you could look at it.
One of the more, I think, amusing reserve valves was this one here, they referred to as an R valve. What you had to do in order to get the remaining air was to push this down and have it come up. I assume that the only main reason why these came about is because of the fact that, like with myself, I'm sure with you, we didn't dive with gauges to begin with. And so the only time when we knew that it was time to come up was when the regulator started breathing hard.
Every manufacturer has a version of one way or the other. You'll notice here we've got a valve for triple tanks, and then it also has a J valve on the outer end.
They came up with, okay, we'll make a O-ring seal. I can imagine why that didn't last very long, because it was hard to look down inside of them, and then they came up with the 3/4 inch O-ring seal, which is what is currently used now. I have a few of my cameras here that I've accumulated over the years. Over time, they improved them in some ways to the Nikonis 1, which is the camera that I started using, and then to the Nikonis 2, 3, 4, and 5. The original lenses that usually came with the camera was a 35. Photography happens to be something that I have done and enjoyed for many years. It's a sport now within a sport, and I now don't use this because they're all film. Probably the only lens here that might be a little bit unique, and I think it's only one of two. It was built by a very well-known photographer, Jack Dreyfus. This is a 16mm fisheye lens. What we have in front of us is a few of the two-hose regulators that have been around for a number of years, not actively used anymore. This is what we started with, and they had different regulators that where basically the air came in one side and you exhaust out the back side. One of the real disadvantages is the fact that your body position in the water really determine how well these things breathe. So when you're actually swimming around face down, they were pretty hard to breathe. If you were walking across the bottom, which you would never do, they breathe great.
I used this regulator here for a couple of years. This is a Nimrod 3-stage.
One of the problems with most of these two-hose regulators is there was no way of monitoring your air supply.
Well, I guess we can move on then into what took their place.
Yes, we have a collection here of single-hose regulators. They had their crude start, but they were certainly a lot better and easier to use than a two-hose regulator. And it breathed much easier because the second stage, or the diaphragm at your mouth, was where the pressure was being regulated and not behind you. This was kind of a unique one where you could switch from going from your snorkel to your regulator. Most of these clamped on. This was a unique style that Healthways came out, where you actually thread directly into the valve, and yet the valve you were able to use other regulators as well.
Many of these regulators breathe. The resistance is easier than a double hose regulator, but we suggest you're probably not using one of these as your primary regulator with the new style of regulators they have today.
Like this regulator and this regulator is basically the same regulator, but one has a J valve on it.
Scuba Pro, which is a pretty famous name in the diving field, of course started coming out with an adjustable second stage so that you could release the resistance.
They experimented again with gauges. You can imagine like this one here, right there, where there's a tiny little gauge to tell your dive buddy how much air you had left.
And finally, they started building them with an additional port for the high pressure so that they can attach a gauge that they could bring around and actually look at themselves and see how much pressure they had left in their breathing cylinder. That was a huge, huge improvement in the diving industry when they did that.
We have several different kinds of gauges here. I think we'll start off with the pressure gauges. Most of us are familiar with. They're gauges that look like this, that you had to turn around and look at it. And then all the manufacturers, like these here, are all different manufacturers, you know, basically use the same gauge.
Other style gauges that the diver would check his tank with before he went diving, he would just attach this. In fact, they still use these today. Attach them to the cylinder and check the pressure.
I think we'll move over to the timers. The oldest timer I have is this one here. Came out in 1960. Actually, this was maybe even before that, but it's one that you strung around your neck. You would turn the outside dial and set it for the number of minutes that your tank would last you. We have some different depth gauges, and it was always nice to know how deep you are, and they made a lot of attempts on this one earlier in the industry, starting off kind of like with capillary type depth gauges like this one. Water came in, and as the air compressed, then you would look at the water level to tell how deep you are.
They were one of the most accurate gauges there was in saltwater. Now everyone uses a computer, but the starting of the computer age, you'll see out here in front where we have some computers that were the start of the computer console age. And you'll see this one from Scuba Pro, one from Farallon. This one also was from Healthways, but it's very much similar to the one from Scuba Pro.
These allowed you to keep track of your nitrogen absorption while you're underwater. And they were marginally accurate. In fact, many people would say that they weren't very accurate at all. If you wore more than one of them, they all read differently. We have several other examples of older gauges. Over time, they, oil-filled and air-filled. Some of the gauges that I really liked was, and these two in particular, I thought was probably some of the best depth gauges ever. And they're air-filled and extremely accurate. A couple of examples of some of the older fins. Many of us have been around for a while. We recognize this particular fin, the Churchill fin, pre-World War II style that had a certainly interesting look about them.
Swim Master built this fin. It's called the Duckfoot. And if you have watched Sea Hunt or any of the old films with divers involved, it would use a fin that looks something like this.
We have a couple of masts here. I don't think I've seen one of these around for a while, where instead of going in with your fingers, you could push these outer things to equalize.
Gripping your nose with your fingers by inserting your fingers up inside and having that corrugated rubber so that it would be easier to clear your ears, we call it, or the eustachian tubes. And then this one also, only this one you would squeeze from the outside, grab your nose or push up against your nostrils and clear your ears.
This is something that is kind of interesting to me, because when I initially started diving, we didn't have any flotation units at all. And they had a little CO2 cartridge on it where if you got to the surface and you felt like you needed a little flotation, then you just pulled a little cord and you would instantly have as much as 10 pounds or so of buoyancy. This is a buoy Fenzi, had its own air supply, so you didn't have to string a hose to it. It had cords that went underneath the crotch and around, and it really came up. You had to always kind of hold them down.
They had these before they ever had what everyone uses now, which is attached to the cylinder or to the regulator, and you fill it right out of your breathing tank.
As time went along, of course, they come up with, Scuba Pro came out with the Stab Jacket, and then there was the ATPAC and integrated weight systems after that.
And in our next session, we'll bring some of those along with us so that we can tell you and show you what and how they work.